This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 5th grade social studies with content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. This screencast covers Georgia Standard of Excellence SS5H2, describe U.S. involvement in World War I and post-World War I America. A. Explain how German attacks on U.S. shipping during the war in Europe, 1914 to 1917, ultimately led the U.S. to join the fight against Germany. Include the sinking of the Lusitania and concerns over safety of U.S. ships, U.S. contributions to the war, and the impact of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. While our focus for this standard is America's involvement in the war, we do need to look very briefly at how the whole business got started and who was fighting whom for contextual purposes. Students do not need to know this, but it does help set the framework for the U.S.'s part in all of it. As with many wars, the kindling was already set. It just took a spark to light the blaze. The spark was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, and his wife in 1914. This set off a cascading chain of events that are outside the scope of our curriculum and far too complex to handle in a screencast. But at the root of it was nationalism. Now, nationalism, a deep sense of pride in one's cultures, belief, and country, can certainly be a good thing. But in the years before World War I, this nationalism for many countries was of a rather extreme kind that ran something along the lines of, "Our country is so much better than yours that we should probably be running your country as well as our own." This attitude, combined with the practice of imperialism, when a nation seeks to acquire colonies outside of its own lands, by many European and Asian nations, made much of Europe understandably nervous. As a result, we also add into this tinderbox the practice of militarism, or the building up of one's army for protection. Well, as we saw with the building of forts during the French and Indian War, as one nation builds its army to protect itself, neighboring nations get nervous and start building up their own armies, and it escalates from there. Now, at the time of the Archduke's assassination, a number of nations had formed, well, not exactly friendships, but rather alliances, as a result of all this nationalism, imperialism, and militarism. These nations felt they could be stronger if they banded together. One such alliance was called the Central Powers. The Central Powers derived their name from them being the Central European nations, specifically the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Later, after the start of the war, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire would join in with them as well. Seeing such a large and powerful alliance forming in their own backyard understandably distressed the other European nations, and so they formed an alliance of their own in opposition to the Central Powers, simply called the Allies, or the Allied Powers. The Allied Powers consisted primarily of the British Empire, the French Republic, Italy, and Japan. So when hostilities finally broke out, nearly all of Europe and much of Asia was quickly embroiled in the conflict. Now, President Woodrow Wilson and the United States were determined to mind our own business and stay out of a war that was going on across the Atlantic Ocean and seemed to have very little to do with us. Despite our previous conflicts with England, we were still family, so to speak, and we still traded heavily with them. In classic military fashion, Germany was trying to isolate England from outside supplies and resources, and in the process had sunk a number of American merchant vessels, though they always apologized afterward. One such attack was on a British passenger ship, the RMS Lusitania, that had sailed from New York and carried many American citizens on board. Once again, Germany apologized, but the attacks continued. And eventually they came right out and said they would sink any ship, regardless of whether they were neutral or not, if they came anywhere near the North Atlantic. America had had enough, and Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. Wilson truly believed, if somewhat naively as history will attest, that this action would make the world safe for democracy and ensure that we would never have another major war. The tragic deaths of the innocent passengers on the Lusitania would become the rallying cry, "Remember the Lusitania," for our nation. A number of new inventions and strategies made fighting in World War I very different from any war before. Previously, guns were unreliable, relatively inaccurate, and slow to load, forcing troops to eventually engage in hand-to-hand combat once initial rounds of gunfire were finished. As guns' distance and accuracy increased, so did the distance troops could stay away from each other. With World War I, we also saw the addition of the machine gun, capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, and the hand grenade, capable of instant destruction with a simple toss. It no longer made sense to run at the enemy and fight in close proximity. Instead, the armies dug shoulder-high, narrow trenches that would provide cover for soldiers while still allowing them to shoot at the enemy. This became known as trench warfare. Unfortunately, both sides took up this strategy, which resulted in the Western Front being a series of long opposing trenches from which the two armies shot at each other, making it difficult for either to make any real progress. They became, quite literally, entrenched. As the Western Front was the front U.S. soldiers were fighting on, that is why we talk about it the most, and so students may develop a misconception that it was just a name given to the place we fought, and not realize that there was an Eastern Front as well. For while Germany and Austria-Hungary fought the English and French on the western border, they were also fighting Russia on their eastern border, at least until internal strife and poor support of the troops from the Russian government forced them to sign an armistice with Germany. The invention of the German submarine, called U-boats for Unterseeboot, were instrumental in Germany enforcing its blockade of England, as illustrated by the sinking of the Lusitania and other American merchant vessels. Eventually we learned anti-submarine tactics, and losses significantly decreased. World War I was also the first war to see poison gas used as a weapon, which proved to be frighteningly effective when used upon soldiers with the limited mobility inherent in trench warfare. We cannot leave a discussion of the new inventions that industrialization brought to the Great War without looking at the airplane. Students will have already learned about the first controlled, powered airplane flight by the Wright brothers in 1903. Now, just 11 years later, the military is looking for ways to utilize it for war. Given their lightweight and limited carrying capacity, planes were originally only used to take aerial photos and do reconnaissance, spying basically, or letting soldiers know the best direction to aim the large guns and artillery, especially given the limited visibility and movement of the trenches. As time went on, pilots soon realized that they could drop grenades from the planes into enemy trenches below, and they could fire their pistols as well. This led the military to begin to recognize their potential as bombers and fighters. Soon they began to experiment with mounting a machine gun on the plane. Enter the era of the dogfight, which was plane-on-plane combat. Pilots, who were called aces, soon began to build reputations based on the numbers of enemy aircraft they had shot down. One such German pilot of this time to reach legendary status was Manfred von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron. The crowded and unsanitary conditions in the trenches unveiled a new enemy that attacked both armies indiscriminately and with devastating results. The flu. The flu pandemic of 1918 was no ordinary flu. Instead of being of concern mostly to the very old or very young, this flu was most deadly to people in their prime, ages 20 to 40, and soldiers were no exception. Living in such close proximity to each other with poor sanitation, entire regiments fell victim. The statistics are staggering. 10 times as many Americans died of the Spanish flu, as it became known, as died in the entirety of the war. Half of all U.S. soldiers died from the flu rather than from enemy fire. At the end of the 2 years the flu had raged across the planet, somewhere between 20 million people had succumbed to it. Probably one of the single largest contributions the U.S. made to the war was personnel. Over 4 million U.S. soldiers were mobilized for the war. Additionally, millions of American citizens went to work here on the home front to produce the food, supplies, and weaponry such a large military effort requires. Factories that made plows and cars and the like were converted to start producing weapons and the other accoutrements of war. It became very popular and patriotic to have a victory garden in your yard to conserve food so there would be more for the troops. It took a bit of time